In moments when global tensions rise, the world tends to focus sharply on the leaders who shape the future, and sometimes those leaders face a spotlight harsher than they ever expected. In recent days, Vladimir Putin has found himself standing in that unforgiving glare. What unfolded on the international stage was not merely criticism, it was a collective reckoning. Nations that once approached Russia with caution spoke plainly, analysts dismantled old narratives in real time, and even Russia's closest partners struggled to defend actions that no longer carry the illusion of strategic brilliance. The world saw a leader exposed, stripped of excuses, stripped of invincibility, and forced into a position where silence said more than speeches ever could. Global leaders publicly challenging Putin's credibility marks a dramatic shift in the tone, confidence, and unity of the international community, a shift that few believed would happen so visibly or so decisively. For years, many nations hesitated to confront Moscow directly, choosing caution over confrontation, but diplomacy over disruption. But this moment represents a breaking point, a rare instance where the world not only speaks with clarity but does so without fear of political repercussions. The dynamic has reversed. Instead of states adjusting their tone to avoid provoking Putin, they now speak bluntly, and it is Putin who appears forced into retreat. This change did not emerge from a single event, but from a mounting series of failures, miscalculations, and global frustrations that finally erupted into open criticism. It was almost cinematic in how quickly the silence fractured, and how rapidly world leaders shifted from guarded statements to unapologetic condemnation. What made this moment even more striking was the confidence behind those words. Leaders who once balanced their language with diplomatic precision now spoke with a level of moral clarity that left little room for misinterpretation. They addressed Russia's aggression, its disinformation, its destabilizing behavior, not in the soft terms of political bargaining, but in the firm tone of global accountability. In televised meetings, international summits, and press conferences, their messages were aligned. The world has grown tired of excuses. This collective voice hit harder than any sanction or military alliance because it exposed something Russia has tried desperately to conceal: its diminishing relevance. It was not merely a challenge to Putin's policies, it was a direct strike at the narrative that he controls, the one he has used to maintain an aura of strength. What captured global attention was not just the criticism itself, but the way Putin reacted to it. For a leader who built his entire image on dominance and unwavering authority, even subtle flinches become magnified. His discomfort in public forums told a story he could not spin. Analysts noticed the pauses, the tightened jaw, the lack of the usual forceful rhetoric. These small cracks signaled something deeper. It showed that the world's leaders weren't just speaking, they were being heard, and the impact was undeniable. Putin was no longer the unshakable figure commanding a room through intimidation or strategic ambiguity. He appeared defensive, even diminished, and that alone reshaped the global perception of his control. This collective challenge also carried a symbolic weight. For decades, Russia projected power by maintaining an environment where criticism was discouraged or carefully measured. But now, with leaders speaking freely and without fear, the illusion of Russian dominance falters. The more the world challenges Putin publicly, the more obvious it becomes that strength cannot be maintained through fear when the world stops fearing. This shift is not simply about politics. It is about global psychology. Intimidation loses its force when people realize the thing they feared is weaker than they once believed. And once that realization spreads, it becomes nearly impossible for any leader to rebuild the same level of influence. Another layer to this moment is the transformation in global communication. Information moves too fast, too widely, and too transparently for old power tactics to survive. Leaders know that their words instantly reach millions, and that public opinion forms in real time. When several of the world's most powerful nations simultaneously questioned Putin's credibility, the effect multiplied across platforms, news channels, and public discourse. Every statement reinforced the next, creating a momentum that Putin could not counter with traditional propaganda or scripted appearances. The speed of modern communication made his defensive posture appear even slower, more outdated, and more disconnected from today's global rhythm. This confrontation did not just shame Putin on the world stage, it revealed a profound and irreversible shift in how power operates in the 21st century. Leaders who challenge misinformation and aggression with confidence now hold the advantage, while those who rely on intimidation face a world that no longer accepts it. The moment global leaders openly questioned Putin's authority, a new reality took shape, one where Russia's old tools of influence no longer carry the weight they once did. And in that realization, Putin's image shriveled not because of force, but because of truth spoken boldly, collectively, and without fear. Russia's narrative collapsing under international scrutiny did not happen overnight. It unfolded like a slow, burning exposure, a moment where carefully constructed illusions were suddenly overwhelmed by the sheer force of global transparency. For years, the Kremlin relied on a familiar pattern: controlled messaging, manufactured public perception, and selective truths designed to strengthen domestic authority and project an image of strategic brilliance to the outside world. But the modern global arena is fundamentally different from the world Russia once manipulated with ease. Today, every claim is dissected, every statement fact-checked, every narrative challenged in real time by analysts, journalists, and digital communities who refuse to accept surface-level explanations. The result was a public dismantling of the Kremlin's messaging machine, a moment where global scrutiny hit hard enough to crack the foundation of Russia's long-standing political storytelling. The unraveling began with small contradictions, the kind that usually go unnoticed in tightly controlled environments, but become glaring in the light of international media. When claims made by Russian officials fail to align with satellite imagery, independent reports, or eyewitness accounts, the inconsistencies became too large to ignore. The world no longer relied on a single narrative. Information now flows from countless sources, each adding a layer of verification. And when multiple nations, investigative groups, and intelligence agencies simultaneously challenged Moscow's statements, Russia's narrative crumbled under the weight of collective evidence. It wasn't just critics pointing out flaws, it was a global chorus revealing truths that could no longer be suppressed. The speed of exposure added another layer of impact. In a digital world, where information travels faster than any government's propaganda machinery can adapt, the Kremlin's attempts to control the story lagged behind unfolding reality. By the time Russian officials crafted their responses, the global audience had already moved on, equipped with verified footage, expert analysis, and alternative perspectives that left little room for distortion. It created a powerful dynamic where Russia appeared constantly on the defensive, reacting instead of leading, denying instead of explaining. This reactive posture damaged credibility far more effectively than direct accusations ever could, pulling the curtain back on a strategy that once seemed untouchable. What intensified the global rejection of Russia's narrative was the sheer confidence with which the truth was presented. International leaders, journalists, and analysts spoke with a unity and assertiveness that cut through political ambiguity. They presented data, timelines, documentation, and visual evidence that left minimal space for counterarguments. Instead of engaging in political rhetoric, they relied on transparency, a tool authoritarian regimes struggle to counter. The more evidence the world presented, the thinner Russia's narrative became, until even neutral observers found it difficult to accept the Kremlin's explanations without questioning their intent. Behind the scenes, something even more profound was taking place. Russia's narrative was not just being challenged, it was losing its psychological power. For years, the Kremlin's messaging worked because it created a sense of inevitability and control. But once that facade began to weaken, once people realized it could be questioned and disproven, the authority behind it diminished rapidly. The global audience, empowered by multiple sources of information, refused to internalize Russia's version of events. When a narrative loses credibility in the eyes of the world, even the strongest propaganda becomes a hollow echo. Putin's discomfort during this unraveling only amplified the impact. When confronted with facts he could not easily dismiss, his usual confidence seemed tempered, and the defensive tone of Russian officials revealed a leadership struggling to contain a narrative slipping beyond their control. This shift was not just political, it was symbolic. It marked a rare moment where truth, not intimidation, took center stage, and where the Kremlin's long-practiced strategy of narrative dominance faltered under pressure it could neither predict nor contain. What makes this collapse so striking is how irreversible it feels. Once the world sees cracks in a narrative, it becomes far more critical of future claims. The trust is gone, the illusion shattered, and no amount of scripted messaging can restore the same sense of authority. Under the relentless scrutiny of global media, Russia's narrative did not just weaken, it lost its foundation. And the world, witnessing the collapse in real time, refused to look away. Putin's confidence faltering as allies stay silent became one of the most revealing moments in the global political landscape, a moment where silence spoke louder than any diplomatic statement, and hesitation carried more weight than open condemnation. For years, Putin relied heavily on the perception that he had a loyal circle of international partners willing to echo his positions or at least refrain from contradicting them publicly. That silence formed the backbone of his geopolitical confidence, a subtle but powerful reinforcement that Russia still commanded a sphere of influence capable of resisting Western pressure. But when allies withheld support at a critical moment, the absence of their voices created a void so deep that even Putin could not conceal the shift in power dynamics. The sudden stillness from partners he once counted on revealed something that could not be ignored. The world around him was changing, and not in his favor. What made this silence so striking was not simply that allies chose not to defend him. It was that their hesitation reflected calculated decisions, not accidental omissions. Nations that once aligned themselves with Moscow began weighing the consequences of continuing that alignment in a world increasingly shaped by transparency, economic interdependence, and the demands of modern diplomacy. Supporting Russia's narrative had always been a risk, but at this point it became a liability. Leaders recognized that standing with Putin could isolate them from the global community, harm their economies, or damage their reputations. And so, instead of rushing to offer explanations on his behalf, they paused. That pause created an unmistakable ripple across foreign ministries and diplomatic corridors, signaling that the cost of defending Putin now outweighed the benefits. This silence carried a psychological blow as well. Putin, who has long crafted an image of unwavering strength, needed the outward appearance of unity to maintain his authority both domestically and internationally. When allies withheld their voices, it left him exposed in a way that undermined his carefully constructed persona. Observers noticed the tension in his responses, the slight defensiveness replacing his usual certainty. Analysts pointed out how each unanswered accusation chipped away at the aura of control he worked so hard to project. Every diplomatic meeting where Allied leaders avoided taking a firm stance in Russia's favor became a spotlight highlighting his vulnerability. More revealing was the strategic nature of this silence. Allies did not turn against Russia outright. They simply chose not to step forward. It was a subtle but powerful shift. Instead of bold statements, there were softer tones, delayed responses, and vague remarks about needing more information. This diplomatic ambiguity was, in itself, a message no one wanted to tie their political future to a leader facing mounting global scrutiny. The hesitation was a form of quiet distancing, a controlled retreat designed to protect national interests without sparking open conflict with the Kremlin. Yet for Putin, who has long thrived on the illusion of deep-rooted alliances, this distancing felt like a crack forming under his feet. The global stage amplified this moment even further. In international forums, when Putin expected supporting voices to counter criticisms or present alternative viewpoints, they were noticeably absent. Instead, discussions tilted heavily against Russia's positions, leaving Putin to respond alone. This isolation made his arguments seem weaker, his defenses more fragile. Leaders who once mirrored his rhetoric now spoke in neutral tones or shifted attention to broader concerns, avoiding direct alignment with Moscow. Their silence created the impression that Putin was battling a global narrative without reinforcement, and every time he stood alone behind a podium, the imbalance became more apparent. Behind closed doors, diplomats described an atmosphere of caution around aligning with Russia. Economic pressures, sanctions, public opinion, and the fast-changing nature of global alliances reshaped how nations viewed their ties to the Kremlin. Silence became the safest strategy, a way to avoid both confrontation with the West and entanglement with an increasingly unpredictable Russian leadership. This behind-the-scenes recalibration spilled into public view, where it became evident that Putin could no longer rely on the chorus that once softened global criticism. In this new reality, Putin's shrinking circle of vocal supporters revealed the most damaging truth of all: confidence built on external approval crumbles quickly when that approval disappears. Allies staying silent did not just weaken his image, it exposed the fragility of the system he built. And the world, watching closely, recognized that even the strongest political figures can falter when the voices that once amplified their power choose instead to fade quietly into the background. The emergence of a new global standard of transparency did more than challenge old power structures. It rewrote the rules entirely, leaving leaders like Putin struggling to navigate a world that no longer bends to secrecy or half-truths. In the past, authoritarian regimes relied on the advantage of controlled information. They dictated the narrative, filtered reality, and shaped public perception with precision. But the world has changed in irreversible ways. Today, technology exposes what once stayed hidden, independent media broadcast what state media suppresses, and ordinary people document events faster than governments can deny them. This shift is not subtle, it is seismic, and in the clash between the old world of controlled messaging and the new world of instantaneous truth, the Kremlin found itself standing on ground that is crumbling beneath its feet. It is this transformation that made Russia's current predicament so striking. Every attempt at narrative manipulation collided head-on with an ecosystem that thrives on verification. Satellite imagery, open-source intelligence, digital forensics, and crowdsourced analysis have become tools of global citizens and institutions alike. They leave little space for ambiguity and even less room for deception. When Russian officials release statements that once would have gone unchallenged, analysts dismantle them within minutes, comparing timelines, examining geolocation data, and overlaying conflicting claims with real evidence. This global army of informed observers has become an unanticipated force, and for regimes reliant on secrecy, it is a force nearly impossible to outrun. The speed at which information spreads has also reshaped the battlefield. In the digital age, it no longer takes days or weeks for inconsistencies to surface, they surface instantly. Videos circulate globally within hours, experts analyze events in real time, and governments issue coordinated responses before authoritarian narratives can take root. When the Kremlin attempted to push outdated talking points, the world saw them unravel almost immediately. And as each narrative faltered, Putin's image took another hit, not because his critics grew louder, but because the truth became too visible to suppress. That visibility is the new power, and it is the one force authoritarian systems are least prepared to confront. One of the most compelling aspects of this shift, is the growing expectation of accountability. Modern citizens demand receipts, evidence, transparency, things authoritarian governments rarely provide. This cultural transformation means leaders who once relied on intimidation now face a world that demands openness. And when they fail to meet that standard, distrust spreads with remarkable speed. In Putin's case, the global community grew increasingly confident in questioning him precisely because they no longer needed to rely on Russian sources to understand the truth. They could verify reality independently, and that independence undermined the Kremlin's ability to control global perception. This transparency-driven environment also exposed the stark differences between nations moving forward and those clinging to outdated methods of control. While progressive countries embraced technology, innovation, and open communication, Russia persisted with strategies rooted in the past. This mismatch became painfully clear on the world stage. Putin's attempts to conceal setbacks, manipulate messaging, or frame events on his own terms felt outdated in a world that had already evolved beyond such tactics. The global public expects clarity, factual consistency, and credible explanations. When Russia failed to provide them, the gap between its narrative and reality became impossible to ignore, and the world responded accordingly. Journalists dissected statements before press conferences even ended, analysts mapped truth against propaganda with almost surgical precision, and political leaders spoke openly about the widening credibility deficit Russia faced. It wasn't simply that the world rejected the Kremlin's messaging, it was that the world had the tools to prove why the messaging was false. This exposed a deeper truth. Once global transparency becomes the norm, the old techniques of narrative control cannot survive. Putin's discomfort in this environment was unmistakable. A leader accustomed to shaping public perception suddenly found himself reacting to it, forced to address facts he could no longer bury or distort. His defensive posture, once masked by confidence and authority, became more visible with each failed attempt to reassert control. The more the world demanded transparency, the more obvious his struggle became. This new global standard, defined by fast information, independent verification, and collective scrutiny, left Russia in a position it had not faced before, accountable to a world that refuses to look away. And, in that world, outdated narratives shrivel under the weight of undeniable truth. Momentum shifting as Russia's power projection weakens is not just a geopolitical adjustment. It is a fundamental transformation in how the world perceives strength, influence, and legitimacy. For decades, Russia relied on a reputation built around military intimidation, strategic unpredictability, and a carefully maintained aura of dominance. But reputations are fragile when they depend on illusion, and today's global environment exposes those illusions with unprecedented clarity. What once seemed formidable now appears rigid, outdated, and increasingly hollow. This shift did not begin with a single event. It built steadily through military missteps, diplomatic failures, and the inability to adapt to a world that rewards innovation instead of aggression. As each pillar of Moscow's influence weakened, the momentum tilted toward nations that operate on cooperation and modern capability, leaving Russia struggling to maintain relevance on a rapidly evolving global stage. Military setbacks played a major role in accelerating this shift. The image of Russia as an unstoppable force has been chipped away by operational failures, logistical problems, and strategic miscalculations that the world has watched in real time. Satellite imagery, battlefield reports, and independent analysis have painted a starkly different picture from the one Russia presents in its domestic media. Instead of projecting fear, the Kremlin increasingly projects desperation, throwing resources at conflicts that drain economic stability and erode internal morale. The more these failures surface, the more global confidence in Russia's military power declines. The mystique of a dominant Russian war machine has been replaced with skepticism, and that skepticism has spread far beyond military circles into diplomatic and economic realms. Diplomatically, Russia's position has deteriorated just as rapidly. Countries that once relied on Moscow as a strategic counterbalance are reassessing those partnerships, wary of being associated with a nation perceived as unpredictable and increasingly unstable. Major international organizations have grown more assertive in confronting Russia's actions, while long-standing allies exercise caution, distance, or silence. This diplomatic erosion is especially damaging because influence in the modern era relies heavily on alliances, economic cooperation, and global integration. Russia, instead of strengthening its connections, finds itself pushed toward isolation, a position that limits its ability to shape global affairs. And each diplomatic setback feeds into the next, creating a chain reaction that makes recovery even more difficult. Economically, the strain is unmistakable. Attempting to maintain global influence through outdated methods, like large-scale militarization and energy leverage, has proven unsustainable. Sanctions, declining foreign investment, and the diversification of global energy sources have chipped away at Russia's economic foundation. The more the world adapts to operate without dependence on Russian resources, the weaker Moscow's leverage becomes. Economic pressure may not be as dramatic as military conflict, but it is far more enduring. Russia's shrinking economic options reveal another dimension of its weakening power projection. A nation that cannot sustain its strategies cannot sustain its influence. Perhaps the most revealing shift is the changing global perception of power itself. Nations today recognize that influence is rooted in technology, economic stability, innovation, and global cooperation. Power is no longer defined by how much territory one can control, but by how effectively a country can engage with the future. In this landscape, Russia's reliance on fear-driven tactics feels increasingly outdated, even counterproductive. While other nations invest in AI, infrastructure, sustainable energy, and advanced industries, Russia invests in narratives built on conflict and coercion. This divergence exposes a growing gap between Russia and countries shaping the next era of global development. The world has also become more unified in countering aggression. When Russia attempts to project power through intimidation, nations respond collectively. Through sanctions, military support to threaten states, international investigations, and public condemnation. This unity dilutes the effectiveness of Russia's strategy and highlights its diminishing ability to divide global powers. Instead of looking like a central global player, Russia appears like a destabilizing force that the world has learned to contain and adapt around. Putin's visible frustration amplifies this momentum shift. His speeches, once delivered with confidence, increasingly rely on recycled narratives, defensive rhetoric, and attempts to revive past glories rather than present achievements. This tone betrays an underlying awareness that Russia's influence is contracting. And the more he tries to assert power through outdated means, the more the world recognizes how much of that power has already faded. This shift in momentum is not temporary, it is structural. Russia's traditional mechanisms of influence are losing effectiveness, and the world has evolved beyond the tactics that once defined its power. What remains is a nation attempting to project strength without the resources, alliances, or global trust needed to maintain that image. And as each attempted show of force reveals deeper vulnerabilities, Russia's place in the global hierarchy continues to shrink, one exposed weakness at a time. The world moving forward without Russia's influence is not just a geopolitical trend, it is a transformation that reveals how global power has evolved beyond the frameworks that once defined it. For decades, Russia positioned itself as a central player in international decision-making, using military muscle, energy leverage, and diplomatic pressure to maintain relevance. But the world today operates on a different wavelength, one shaped by innovation, cooperation, economic resilience, and the pursuit of long-term stability. In this environment, nations that cling to outdated forms of power find themselves watching from the sidelines as others build the future. And that is exactly what is happening to Russia. The world is accelerating, adapting, and aligning in ways that leave Moscow struggling to keep pace, its influence shrinking as others take the lead. This shift becomes even more apparent when examining where global investments and priorities are moving. Countries are pouring resources into technology, artificial intelligence, green energy, advanced manufacturing, cybersecurity, and space exploration. These are fields that define the future of global power, arenas where innovation matters more than intimidation, and progress matters more than posturing. While nations in Europe, Asia, and North America push forward with ambitious initiatives, Russia remains anchored to strategies rooted in the past, focusing on coercion and conflict rather than development and modernization. That stagnation has consequences. The world's technological and economic transformations continue with or without Russia, and each step forward leaves Moscow more isolated from the systems that now shape global influence. Diplomatically, this divergence is even more pronounced. International alliances have grown stronger without Russia's participation. NATO has expanded, regional partnerships in the Indo-Pacific have deepened, and global organizations are aligning around shared values of stability, transparency, and cooperation. In contrast, Russia's circle of influence narrows. Countries that once engaged with Moscow out of strategic necessity are now looking elsewhere for partnerships that offer stability and economic opportunity rather than risk and uncertainty. The world is discovering alternatives to Russian energy, alternatives to Russian markets, and alternatives to Russian political leverage. As these alternatives solidify, Russia's role becomes less indispensable and more peripheral, a shift that would have been unthinkable a decade ago. What accelerates this change even further is the speed at which nations are adapting. Energy markets are transforming rapidly, with renewable power expanding across continents and reducing global dependency on Russian oil and gas. Economies are rerouting supply chains toward more reliable partners. Global institutions are rejecting the fear-based politics that once gave Moscow influence. With every adaptation, Russia loses a point of leverage it once relied on. Its economic threats carry less weight, its diplomatic warnings sound increasingly hollow, and its ability to divide the international community has weakened dramatically. Even more telling is the world's cultural shift. Nations and populations alike are increasingly drawn to models of governance that prioritize innovation, opportunity, and global integration. The idea of strength through force is fading, replaced by strength through adaptability and progress. Russia's rigid political and economic structures stand in direct contrast to this global movement. And because the modern world rewards flexibility and openness, Russia's refusal to evolve has pushed it further into self-imposed isolation. The result is a global environment where Russia watches breakthroughs it cannot participate in, technologies it cannot match, alliances it cannot influence, and opportunities it cannot access. Inside Russia, the effects are just as visible. Young talent leaves the country in search of better opportunities. Businesses look to more stable markets. Investors hesitate to commit to long-term growth in an environment marked by unpredictability. The more disconnected Russia becomes from global development, the harder it becomes to rejoin it. Momentum matters. The world is moving forward, and Russia is not keeping up. Putin's struggle to maintain relevance highlights the depth of this shift. His attempts to assert influence through force, fear, or nostalgia clash sharply with a world focused on advancement and cooperation. His appeals to past power sound increasingly out of step with a global community that has already moved on. And the more Russia insists on using outdated strategies, the more obvious its stagnation becomes. In this new global era, influence is earned through innovation, trust, stability, and partnership, qualities the modern world values far more than intimidation. As nations continue to build systems that bypass Russia entirely, Moscow's place in the global order diminishes. The future belongs to those who adapt, and the world is adapting without waiting for Russia to catch up. Let this moment be more than a headline or a temporary shockwave. Let it serve as a turning point where global power is redefined, not by intimidation but by intelligence, not by isolation but by collaboration, not by rigid systems, but by courageous innovation. History shows us that leaders who refuse to change eventually collapse under the weight of their own outdated principles. But the world that's coming next belongs to those who think boldly, act responsibly, and operate with integrity. The world is watching, the world is evolving, and no amount of denial can stop progress that has already begun.